Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Nicole Lamberson, and I trained as a physician assistant. I volunteer doing outreach for the film, Medicating Normal, and I host conversations like this one today. I'm really excited to welcome our guest today. It is Rob Wipond. He is a freelance journalist who writes frequently on the interfaces between psychiatry, civil rights, policing, surveillance, and privacy, and social change. His articles have been nominated for 17 magazine and journalism awards, and he's the author of a new book called Your Consent Is Not Required: The Rise in Psychiatric Detentions, Forced Treatment, and Abusive Guardianships. And we will link the book below for anybody who's interested. So, hey, Rob, welcome. Thanks for joining us today.
All right. Thank you. It's great to be here. And yeah, I was just thinking this morning about, I just love to give interviews because just these topics are so important, and there's so many ways in which everything, related to psychiatry right now is important in society, writ large.
Yeah. When I was getting questions together and looking through your book and everything, I was like, oh, I have like so many questions. I even asked you, like, if we go over, is that okay? Because there's so many things where I was like, I don't know the answer to this, and I want to know. So I think let's just dive in. I mean, first, you're a journalist, and it's, kind of strange, I guess, to be interested in psychiatry because a lot of people don't care or they don't want to know. It's like a stigmatized type of topic. So I'm wondering, like, why did you get into writing about psychiatry, civil rights, like the privacy aspect of it? Do you have like a personal or family
Yeah,
history
I
with
do
that?
have some personal connections. There's a big one in the book, the introductory chapter. I'll talk about that in a second. But really, it began in childhood, almost in certainly in my youth, where I just always had an interest in the inner life of the mind, and became interested in meditation. Uh, Different kinds of books that I was reading at that time were about self-exploration and discovery and change. So I always had that interest, and I was exposed to some critical writing because it was still quite well known at that time. It was very big in the 1960s. Some of these critical writers like Thomas Szasz and R.D. Laing, Timothy Leary, a lot of these people were famous then. I grew up later than that, but still some of them were kind of well known still. And so I was exposed to that a little, just in the back of my mind. And then what happened that was huge for me was later in life, in probably when I was in my 30s, my father was going through a difficult time for sure. Some important things had happened in his life. And he ended up talking with my brother and mother, and they took him into a psychiatric hospital, as we're often told to do, just seeking help and saying, yeah, I am struggling, I'd like some help. Well, they pretty much immediately certified him against his will, locked him up, and began to run him through a battery of psychiatric drugs, which just seemed to make him worse and worse, and multiple drugs at once. And he could barely stand at times. It was just brutal. I was living there with them for a while, so I witnessed a lot of this really close up. And then they proceeded to recommend ECT, electroshock therapy, because none of these drugs were working. And we're like, what? You still do that? And, oh, yeah, it's a first-line treatment for treatment-resistant depression. They give us these stories. And yeah, so I witnessed this god-awful thing go down, where my dad ultimately lost a lot of his long-term memory in particular. He did get some of it back, but not all of it. And it was just a brutal experience, the way they treated him, the way they treated us as the family. We were all supportive and concerned and asking questions, and they just started to kind of treat us with great disrespect, I would say. And so I really just sort of witnessed that as a whole. And went, gosh, if this is happening to my father, who's a career college professor of computer engineering, no history of mental health issues per se, and a family, that's educated and privileged and fortunate in all those ways you would like to be in North American society, and we're being bowled over. I thought, who else is this happening to, and what's happening to them? So I reached out to really really one of the first contacts was Mind Freedom at that time. And they connected me with some people in Vancouver and Victoria, where I was living at that time. And I started to write about it. And just the more I researched, the more aghast I was at how all this plays out.
Yeah. And so at that time, I guess you didn't have any knowledge. You were kind of like naive, like all the rest of us, to the injustices of psychiatry until that.
Yeah, you think that stuff's ancient history because that's usually how it's covered in the media or whatever. Oh yeah, that was then. Right? And I quickly realized, okay, there's some really dramatic and dark things happening, even in an average, nice, quote unquote, reputable psychiatric hospital today in a nice city in Canada. Like, what else is going on? So yeah, I did just start to research. And even as my dad was going through this, we're like, well, okay, what are these drugs? And, I took that approach as I was doing with anything. I've always been a bit of a self-educated person and started really looking into research studies and reading what the manufacturers are saying, what the government was saying, the health regulators. And so learning a lot really rapidly. And then as soon as I started to talk with more people who'd been through involuntary commitment, the light really went on for me, because it's one thing if you kind of think, well, some people are a little maybe misinformed when they make a decision about taking a drug. But if you don't even get to make the decision, that's a pretty cut and dried situation where this is being forced down your throat, even against active resistance, or maybe you do know already that you don't want it. Maybe you've tried it already. And I'm just witnessing this kind of stuff. And immediately I went, wow, this is a profound civil rights issue.
Yeah. And so all that time ago, when you started digging around, I mean, what was out there? Was Bob Whitaker there yet? Did you find much in the critical space, I guess?
Yeah, early on, that was some of Bob Whitaker was one of the early people I discovered. Bruce Levine was another one. David Oakes and Mind Freedom were really busy at that time doing tremendous work. And yeah, so I'd say those are Peter Bregan, of course, was still well known at that time and making some headway with some of his books had sold quite well. Just prior to that time or around that time. So yeah, I had something to draw on that was helping me understand the drugs, but I didn't find a lot about force. And that's still true today. Like, there aren't really many journalists at all, and there aren't many writers at all that write in a regular way about involuntary commitment, forced treatment. And so that's one of the reasons I've kept at it and ultimately decided to do a book about it, because there really just aren't that many.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it is kind of like this little subset. I mean, just doing the work I do, we get emails all the time from people who voluntarily took the medications and who want to come off. And every once in a while, you get a message from somebody like, well, what do I do? Like, I'm being court ordered. And I kind of like, oh, I'm not really sure how to actually answer that. It's like, it's this whole other topic that is, well, when your rights are taken away, what do you tell these people? So
yeah, and I get messages like that all the time. And I do have some discussion in the book of kind of what I've culled from other people sharing with me of what worked for them or didn't in their attempts to get out of forced treatment, and what I've learned on my own from witnessing these situations. So I include some of that in the book, and there are, I think, things that help, but boy, it's tough. The laws are very, very powerful in most states and provinces across North America, and it is not an easy task often to pull yourself out of that kind of situation once you're tangled in it. So I think one of the best things people need to know is just be aware of it. Be aware of how often it happens, how difficult it can be to get out, so that when you go into it, you're kind of mindful and prepared. I think that's one of the best things that people can actually do to protect themselves.
yeah, or you can avoid going into it at all costs if you possibly, like, warning, this is because I don't think people know, like, you and your family taking your dad innocently, like, you thought you were delivering him to help, and then all of a sudden it turns crazy and people have no even inkling that it can wind up in these horrible situations when they first go in and sort of voluntarily walk in the doors, you know?
Yeah, and I have a whole chapter in my book specifically focusing on this issue of people going in voluntarily, seeking help, and ending up detained and forcibly treated, and they're aghast, and they should be, right? Because of course we often hear, oh, we only forcibly treat people if they lack insight, quote unquote, into their illness and their need for treatment. But no, these are people who are saying, hey, I really am struggling, I can see that, I'd really like some help, hey, I'd like to try some different treatments. Do you have it? Maybe they ask for non-drug treatments of some kind, and they quickly find, oh, guess what, most psychiatric hospitals in North America don't offer virtually anything in terms of non-drug treatments. And then they say, well, I don't really want this drug, or I tried a tranquilizer once, I didn't really like the feeling. And they're like, too bad, now you're quote unquote lacking insight. It can be that easy and that quick that determination happens. And so people really need to be aware. And there's this whole thing called mandated reporting. If you talk about having suicidal feelings, people are basically required then to, under their licensing, social workers and mental health professionals under their licensing are required to then probe you more deeply about any kind of feelings of violence or any kind of feelings of self-harm you might be having. And then if they're unsure or if they're worried, they're essentially required to get you institutionalized. So it's shocking. And I've heard these stories a lot about how people don't even feel safe. Once this has happened once, they know, and now they don't feel safe going to therapy, anything like that. It's terrible, right? Because it's creating fear in the culture among a really vulnerable part of the population, or I don't even want to say part of the population, because I think all of us go through these kinds of experiences at time, right? So it's just when people are going through some of the most vulnerable parts of their own lives, this risk is very real.
Yeah, I even had my own situation. I mean, luckily it didn't escalate into anything worse, but when I was a victim of all this polypharmacy that was adversely affecting me, I was on, 6 drugs at the same time, and I became suicidal on them, and they just were making me so ill. And I wound up in the emergency room, and they said, oh, let's just have you voluntarily go over to the psychiatric hospital. You'll be in the unlocked section, and at that time I was so scared of like what was happening to me. So I'm like, okay, sure, we'll do that. And we go, and the unlocked section turned into you're in the locked section. They took all my stuff away, and I was like terrified, stuck in this place, like, how did this even happen? These people just lied to my face, and now I'm in here, and I know I don't belong here. Like but I was like panicking, desperate. And I remember there was like one nurse or something who was like whispering to me, like, honey, if you want to get out of here, like you have to stop, freaking out, and you have to, she was like giving me tips and tricks and all of that. And finally, when the doctor showed up, I just very calmly said, I think I'm having adverse drug reactions. And he was like, oh yeah, you don't belong here. And he let me go. But I was there for like 13 or 14 hours or something. And that was enough for me that I never wanted to experience anything like that again. And I saw like just how quickly they could lie to you and just take all your stuff, and you have no power anymore at all.
Wow.
So,
Wow. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, because you just hit on like 20 issues and themes, right, that are in my book that revolve around these kinds of situations. And yeah, that's powerful. I think this is one of those I'll respond to, immediately is I think people need to think about what is involuntary commitment, what is forced treatment, because I'm not sure what people have in their heads if they've never gone through this or witnessed someone go through it, what kind of vague picture they have. I think it's something like, police bring you in a really friendly way, and they talk with you in this really respectful way, and then you talk it through and you make a decision together. And that does happen on occasion. I've heard people say that if you get a really respectful situation, you're what I call nominally involuntary. You're technically involuntary on the books, but really it's a collaborative situation. And that's great when that happens. They're much better than what's more typical. And what I've seen is more going in the direction you experienced, right? Where they start to lie, they start to mislead, you're getting different messages from different people on the staff, you're freaking out, you're panicking because you can't believe this is happening, and that's making them diagnose you as even more ill, and so it's backfiring, and you know, and force can start. If you start to really resist, it means restraints. You know, they strap you down to a gurney, 4-point restraints. They'll rip your clothes off. I know talk to people who have their clothes cut off with scissors, where they're being restrained by multiple security guards and then injected with a powerful tranquilizing concoction. And just it can be like really frightening and terrifying, especially if you have no idea this can even happen. You're wondering, where have I landed? You know, and most people don't realize this not only happens, it happens on a daily basis in institutions around the country, and it's so underreported. It's just shocking. And you know, like, and I you talk about that fear, and I just want to emphasize that that's so common, you know, and understandably.
Yeah. And like how easy it is to, I mean, in my case, I went naively because they made it look like it was something that could help me. But I have friends in the withdrawal community, you know, who are just normal folks in severe psychiatric drug withdrawal. And all it takes is like the word of, you know, like the word of somebody else who, like, people could be angry at you, or your family could be annoyed with you or whatever. And all they have to do is like make one phone call and say something. And they just believe it's like your word against theirs, you know?
Yeah. And often, of course, this is like a qualified, reputable physician or medical staff member against a person who's now been labeled as severely mentally ill and in a crisis. So immediately the power imbalance, the credibility imbalance that's been imposed for any third party listening is extreme. And I see this in medical records. One thing I've learned from looking at many people's medical records when people shared them with me was that they're unlike any normal medical records. So what happens in a normal medical record is the doctors, the medical staff are trying to be as detailed and accurate as possible, because this is life and death. It could be, you know, what kind of cancer does this person have? What does the lab report say? What do we know about that? What do we know about the treatments? Like, there's this effort to be super accurate all the time.
How many centimeters big is the tumor? You know?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then you get into the world of psychiatry. Well, they've got no lab tests, nothing. And then, and actually what the medical record is it serves a very deliberate purpose, and that is it's like building a legal case. That's what they're doing in their medical records. It's rare that you'll see one that's truly neutral. It's always they're thinking ahead to, well, if we want to detain this person, or if we are detaining this person, we need to build up the case for that. And so that's often what you're seeing is a really biased, cleverly constructed argument that these people are trained to write, in the same way a lawyer is trained to write a legal argument. They're trained to write a legal argument that makes a person sound even crazier than they may be acting in any particular moment, much crazier. And it's and I just say crazy in a rhetorical way, because I think, as we can talk about, right, these notions of mental illness versus mental health are so blurry and so unscientific. So I just say, you know, they're portraying a person in this way, you know, when I don't want to say that people are, always acting completely ordinary in these situations. Often people are going in a difficult time in their lives. Maybe they really are struggling with something. So, but then that just gets amplified and used against them in the most dramatic and disturbing ways.
Yeah. So we're talking about, like, you know, people who are just having, I mean, our film is called Medicating Normal because we think that lots of normal life situations are being misdiagnosed and or pathologized and treated with medications where it's not necessary. But I think when it comes to like involuntary commitment and all of these talks about, like, you know, people being locked up against their will and restrained and all of that, most members of society would say, like, oh, that doesn't happen to normal people. You know, it's always dangerous, violent, like, where else are we supposed to put these like people who are severely schizophrenic and, a risk to themselves and other people? In your research for the book, how, like, did you find a clear percentage of like people who are being involuntarily committed who would fall under that category versus like normal or, less severe?
Well, we have to say right off the bat that the tracking of involuntary commitment across North America is terrible. It's abysmal. We really need to criticize our governments and our psychiatric institutions for doing such a poor job. In the age of electronic records, there's really no excuse for how poor the tracking is and how they don't track outcomes. There's no evidence in the scientific research nor in actual real world data that anybody gets better, that anybody improves from involuntary commitment. And we really need to know that and to start putting more pressure on. Let's at least find out, who are these people? What's happening to them? Are they even being helped? So that's part of the broader background. Now, I set out to do the best job I could in that environment. To certain states, certain provinces do have some semblance of numbers and tracking. And what we're seeing there is the rates of involuntary interventions are going up and up and up, and have been for decades. There's been no drop, no discernible drop at all. And in fact, much faster than other comparable Western European countries. We seem to be using it as a policing tool. And I mean very broadly as a policing tool. So yes, there's a category within that are people who are really struggling, who are, have had maybe chronic issues that date back to their childhood, victims of childhood abuse, maybe early addictions in their lives, maybe a host of problems. And so, yeah, there is a category, a group of people that fall into that, but there's no evidence that they're being helped by this system at all. So that's important to point out. It's just when people say, oh, well, let's lock them up. Well, why? Like, because that's not helping. And it's also important to be clear that civil commitment, my book is mainly about civil psychiatric commitment. And when we talk about actual violence, acts of serious violence, that's a whole other system. It's called the forensic psychiatric criminal system. And that needs exposure. But my book is focused on, generally law-abiding, non-violent citizens who maybe, the form of violence that might emerge in some of those cases would be maybe they pushed somebody in the middle of an argument, or maybe they expressed a threat in some way that someone was frightened by, or things like that. That's way more common, and that's even just a small subgroup of this broader category. So, and then what people often don't understand is they think the laws have become very strict, but in fact, the opposite has been happening for several decades. So the laws have been broadening here. So it's far beyond danger to self or others. Even that is treated very generally and vaguely in court hearings a long time. Often it can just simply be that somebody was behaving in a way that, like I just described, or even simply that they're a danger to themselves in the sense that, well, we think they can't function very well. Somebody else might beat them up because they're saying such crazy things. Like that's in Jim Gottstein's book. He talks about that in the Zyprexa papers, how he has a client who basically just annoys everyone. And as a result, they say, well, we have to lock him up for his own safety because people like to beat him up. Like that's literally what's being said in these hearings. So then I saw a much wider spectrum of society being subjected to these kinds of laws. And, I can start that list. I'll take a breath here right now, but yeah, that's mainly what my book is about. In fact, is exactly what you're asking, is looking at much more quote unquote ordinary types of situations, a wide spectrum of people that average people would not suspect were being subjected to these laws, being subjected. Starting with one of them would be in the school system. So we have all sorts of schools out there routinely using psychiatric interventions and calling 911, getting police to take children as young as 6 years old, 7 years old, up to psychiatric institutions when they're misbehaving in class in some way, when they're expressing distress in some way. And we do have data from Canada and the US, particularly Florida, has excellent data on this, of just the astronomical increases in how often schools are using forced psychiatric interventions to detain children in this way. And I think that just sort of opens up our thinking on, oh, wait a minute, how are these laws really being used, you know? And yeah, I got a list that I can continue going on, but I don't know. I'll take a breath for a moment.
Yeah, sure. What you mentioned about, like, you know, sort of the burden of proof of, well, if we're doing something, I mean, we don't have great data, which you're saying, and I wonder, like, is that on purpose, or, you know, they just aren't being required? So a lot of times when things like this, especially like government and laws, if someone's not requiring of them, they just won't do things like that. But I'm wondering, like, when you were writing your book, I'm sure you came across the study. I was interviewing an expert on suicide a week or two ago, and he said that there's a clear study that being subjected to psychiatric hospitalization actually, like, drastically increases the rates of suicide for people who come out of psychiatric hospitals. Have you seen that study? And are there
yes,
other?
absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's more than one study. There's a good number of studies that have found that's the best research we have on hospitalization. And we must note that's not even forced hospitalization. Those weren't separated out from from people going voluntarily to psychiatric hospitals. And we find that there's something about that experience that seems to make even people who were not suicidal to begin with are coming out dramatically more suicidal. Like, if you ever see research into things that make people feel suicidal out there in the news media, this is actually orders of magnitude worse. It's the psychiatric hospitalization appears to be the most suicidogenic thing in our society. So it really needs to be talked about more. What's going on there? Why is that happening? And I think, you know, your experience highlights probably some of the things that are happening is that people find these experiences very scary. They're often shocked by how poorly they feel on these drugs, and that actually amplifies their whatever struggles they were having beforehand, because they think, this is my last ditch effort to feel better, and if these drugs make me feel worse, okay, well, now I might as well kill myself. These are the kind of things I think that are happening, although we don't have good studies to show that. But yes, the suicidality is huge, and that's the best research we have. And you also asked around the, you know, whether or not people are doing this deliberately. I kind of think it is that. I can't prove that, but you know, there were so many people I talked to about, why don't you have this data? Why aren't you tracking this data? And they just stonewall me. They wouldn't give me answers. They give me stupid answers that were ridiculous, not even worth quoting, you know, stuff like this. And so I started to think this is clearly intentional. Like, I think they know that it doesn't look good on them. There's no way it can look good on them, no matter what those numbers are, no matter what that data is going to show. People are not getting better. They would not report well upon these experiences generally. And so, yeah, I think it is. Although David Cohen at UCLA, who's researched this a lot, I interviewed him, he also just suggested, well, you know, I guess I'd put it this way. It's part of the way the system works. Whether you think of it as deliberate or not, it's part of the operational daily reality of our psychiatric system today, that they do not track this information and they do not track outcomes. So at the very least, people need to know that this is the way the system works.
Yeah. When you talk about, you know, like it not helping people and in fact making them more suicidal, I mean, for anyone who's ever been in a place like that, like my situation, I was only there for 12 hours, but I'm like, after the fact, thinking, well, I mean, it's not rocket science to understand why it's traumatic, and it's like the most non-therapeutic thing I've ever experienced. And when I hear other people describe what it was like, you know, sometimes after something really awful and traumatic, like you have to use humor, you know, to cope with it. So I had a friend who had a really severe benzo withdrawal, and he wound up in a psychiatric facility during that, and he's totally healed and recovered now. And so we can laugh together about some of the things, you know, he experienced. But he sent me like this reel or something from Instagram, or, you know, those short videos that are meant to be funny. And it was like somebody walking through the psych ward, like checking off all of these things, like, oh, here's your, you know, shoes with no laces, and here's your door with no locks, and your, you know, pillow with no pill, like anything you could injure yourself with or whatever. And it was kind of meant to be funny, like how ridiculous, you know, this is. But when we think about it, it's like so just cold and sterile, and how like all these people were just sitting watching like Judge Judy in a, like on a couch, and like waiting for the doctor to show up, you know? So how could we think that it would be beneficial at all anyways, you know, just based on what we do to people?
Yeah, it shocks me that it's you and
Yeah.
I, speaking out about this, and not every mental health professional out there saying, hey, we got to stop doing this. This is so counter-therapeutic. It
Yeah.
never ceases to amaze me that there are not more speaking out, because yeah, if I'm a professional therapist trying to help somebody, like clearly I would see this level of taking away people's rights, and the kind of atmosphere in the average hospital is just so counterproductive and not conducive to any kind of healing, even just feeling comfortable and safe, let alone healing. So yeah, I'm kind of amazed at the whole thing, frankly. And
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm wondering if you ever, like when you were writing your book and researching, did you talk to anybody who actually like benefited from commitment or involuntary commitment, and who said like, oh yeah, it was good for me?
yeah, but I gotta say, even then it was difficult to really, it varied what it meant, I guess I'd say this way. So there were certainly people who had what I called this nominally involuntary experience. They were really acting out, somebody kind of pressured, coerced. Maybe they were doing something pretty zany at the time, and so police intervened. But by the time they got to the hospital, they were calmed down. They got met by medical staff who were respectful, and they had a conversation, and the person was open to taking some psychiatric medications. Maybe they had experienced them in past and did want them again, or they hadn't, but they were willing to try. So they had a back and forth, and they started with a small dose, and they were there for a day or two, and it all kind of felt okay, and they were let go. So I heard those kinds of experiences. And I call those not really even involuntary, right? Because it's so nominal that it's not really what my book's about. My book is about the person who says, no, yeah, I don't want that for whatever reason. And usually there are very many good reasons for this, because these drugs tend to not be very effective, and the adverse effects can be brutal and all of that. So people can have very good reasons for declining them. And then things started to play out. That's what my book is really about. Then that's when you're really being held against your will. That's when you're applying for a hearing, and you may go through all of that. So those people almost never report any. Well, I wouldn't say that none of them ever said, well, in the end, I was glad that I was on the drugs, but all of them said, well, there was this, and this, that boy, they could have done that differently. And it sure would have been a better experience for me overall. Like I felt really harmed and abused. And then there's another category of person that really was harmed and abused repeatedly. And honestly, I did include a couple people like that in my book, but as they told the story, it was troubling for them and for me to hear it, because often that brutality continued for decades in their lives, and they were suffering enormously from the adverse effects of some powerful antipsychotic medications. One of my sources even died of what clearly appeared to be a very well-known side effect of this particular drug while I was doing a series of interviews with him. So he was one of the people who said, I'm glad that it happened. He was never really violently coerced. He was pressured over a long period of time and finally gave in, and then went, I do feel better. I feel like they're helping me. But even that, my own assessment was, I'm not sure that you have truly lived your
Yeah.
best life. And he wasn't really sure himself either. It was a hesitant, I think so. And I respected that. but yeah, and then he died from this adverse effect that he himself had highlighted for me, going, yeah, this is one of the downsides, that I've experienced. And they switched him from one drug to another, trying to alleviate one severe thing where he couldn't function at all. He couldn't work at all for years. And then they finally reduced him on a different drug. He was grateful for that. And so then he could work again. But then, he caught a serious form of cancer, which was a known side effect of an anti-diabetes drug that they'd given him to counteract the diabetes he developed as a result of the antipsychotic, right? So you're looking at this and you're going, okay, does that really qualify as true gratitude for the situation, or just someone who isn't really sure that they could have lived a better life? And maybe they couldn't have, but it's something, I guess I'd just say, we really need to discuss that as a society, and he needs to have the support to have alternatives available, because I also felt it was clear he didn't feel he had any alternatives to do this. He didn't have other supports in his life. He did go through some really difficult periods. So again, when we say, are people grateful? Sort of, but even those people often qualify it in ways that are meaningful and significant, and that we should respect and talk about more as a society, and not just say it's an on-off switch of some people love it, because it's rare. I almost never see that.
Yeah. I know you said the numbers are bad, but like every time I think of, psychiatric hospitalization, even when it's forced or like against somebody's will, like their family has forced them in there, or they did something and the cops took them away there, it seems like it's like a 2 to 3 day stint or something, and then they're released, and then everyone's like, oh, we don't have any beds in the psych hospitals, they're completely overrun, and so we have to just sort of get people in and get people out. What is your response to that? And from researching your book, like, is it a big percentage of people that it's not a 3-day stint? Are people in these places long term and then sentenced to a lifetime of injections once they are released?
Yeah. So the best we can tell from the data is most of them, yes, are quite short term, but short term can be anywhere from 1 to 3 days up to a month. A more average amount of time seems to be around 5 to 14 days, maybe 2 to 3 weeks, somewhere in there, depending on the institution and the region, the state and funding and all that. So generally they are shorter term. If we're going to compare that to back in the 1950s, when we had these large asylums and people would basically be in there for months, years, lifetimes. So that's a lot less common today, for sure. Mm-hmm. That said, what's happening is, and this is often not talked about, is there's been enormous increases in funding to these community-based beds. So aside from enormous increases, as we closed asylums, we opened up private psychiatric hospitals, long-term care facilities, nursing homes, group homes, assisted living, veterans medical centers. There are all sorts of other types of hospitals, as well as long-term living situations that people are ushered into, where they can be subjected from anywhere to, yes, severe 24/7 coercive treatment with full medical staff there at all times, to ongoing interactions where they may be visited from once a day to 2 or 3 times a week by medical personnel who are just checking in. Maybe they're being given a long-term antipsychotic injection that lasts a month or 2 at a time, so they're never off of these drugs, or they're being witnessed in person. We're here to make sure you're taking your drugs today, and these people watch it. So it can be highly coercive environments, and this is very underreported, very understudied, but it's clear from the data we can gather that it's widespread, and that this is really what has replaced the 1950s asylums. We have more beds today, and I put up data recently. A more detailed analysis than I have in my book is now on the Mad in America website, where I look at this in detail. And for example, in California and New York State, it looks like they've got maybe double or triple the number of psychiatric beds that existed in the 1950s. 50s, so far from this dearth of beds, but most of them don't exist in hospitals. Some of them do, but most of them exist in these kinds of other sort of group home type facilities, or even apartments, average apartments, where people are getting subsidized support there, as well as ongoing mental health and social work type interventions, some of which they want, some of which are actually helpful to these people and they're voluntary, but other ones often coming with them that are highly coercive.
Mm. And there's also things like, I mean, one of the more famous ones that people are, I think, only aware of because it happened to a famous person was like Britney Spears and her guardianship. I mean, in your book, that's considered also a type of involuntary thing, correct? Because tell us even, I'm not really clear even on what the guardianships are.
Yeah. I mean, I talk a bit about the Britney Spears case, and I call guardianships like the nuclear option of forced treatment, because essentially then all of your life decisions are permanently taken away from you, and someone else, and this could be, say, a family member can apply, a professional guardian can apply. Some states and provinces have a public guardian and trustee who can take over. Any of these people can kind of apply to a court to kind of get a guardianship over a person, and essentially then have absolute control over every aspect of that person's life, from where they live and who they visit, whether or not they're allowed to have a phone, who they're allowed to phone. And all of this was happening to Britney Spears. We all wondered for years, well, if she doesn't like the guardianship, why isn't she speaking out? And lo and behold, we subsequently discovered, as she said herself in a court hearing, that she asked to be made public, and the judge granted it, where she said that all of her communications with the public were being monitored and controlled by the guardians. So you can imagine, when you've got the kind of resources and clear capacity that Britney Spears had, because here she was, all while this was going down, doing performances and clearly functioning for all intents and purposes like a pretty ordinary person with a lot of capacity. So if this can happen to her with all the resources at her disposal, what's happening to people who are in more vulnerable situations for any reason? And this was a huge, again, we don't have good data. Even the government, as a result, in part of the publicity around Britney Spears, the federal government is trying to move some legislation along to require states to begin tracking how many people are even under these things, what's happening to them, who gets out of them. It seems like hardly anyone ever gets out of them ever. It's a vast, dark area of our society, but it seems to involve over 1 million, potentially millions of people on these. And of course, some of them are needed. They're not all psychiatric related. Some of them could be a person in a coma, or a person with a severe disability who can barely function, and they really need that kind of support in their lives. Sometimes they are really coming from loving family members who are just trying to have the authority to make sure that their adult child, who has some real difficulties, has the support and capacity that they need. So that goes on as well. We just really don't have a good picture of it. And that's just one of the ones you're highlighting. So we saw Britney that's a great case of clearly a somewhat ordinary, quote unquote, normal person who gets subjected to forced treatment because she was being forcibly drugged throughout that period. And she complained vehemently in her own testimony about some of the severe effects of these tranquilizing and sedating drugs. So there's her, I mentioned the school system earlier. And her situation had to do with a family conflict. That's something I saw very commonly. So, we often assume, oh, well, a family member must have the best of intentions if they're trying to get somebody locked up and forcibly treated against their will. Well, Britney herself has raised questions about whether it was good intentions that got her into that situation. And I can say I saw many circumstances where, after talking with multiple parties in the same family, I felt that it was the family being very abusive unnecessarily to somebody else in the family, just targeting them. And that's a really common way that people are getting funneled funneled into forced treatment and often into guardianships as well. And then a lot of those people are being put in long-term care and nursing homes. That's another place we're seeing forced treatment is rampant. It's so bad that the Center for Medicare and Medicaid has recently launched a massive investigation to people being getting bogus diagnoses of schizophrenia who are in long-term care. They're just suddenly spontaneously diagnosing these elderly people with the emergence of schizophrenia late in life, which almost never happens under any kind of circumstances that is legitimately considered scientific at all. And suddenly it's happening widespread, and people think, and it seems to be lots of evidence, that it's just merely to justify drugging these people with heavy-duty tranquilizers. And that's why CMS has launched a formal investigation into the practice. So we see it there, again, and that's where a lot of people in guardianships are being funneled. And and it goes on and on from there, the widespread. I want to use this guardianship example just to hinge on how many other people are being subjected to these, because I'm seeing in workplace conflict situations where people get into a conflict with a higher level employee, their employer, and suddenly they're getting pressured to go on a psychiatric medication or pressured into a psychiatric evaluation. We see it used in protest situations against complainers and disruptive people, banks, airports, tax authorities. I saw examples of this, people being subjected to involuntary detentions in these circumstances and getting funneled into really dangerous situations. So that's just a high-arcing overview of the power of these laws and how so many people are being subjected in very powerful ways.
Yeah, it's frightening too, to think like, oh my gosh, we're all gonna get old, and is that what awaits us? Is this abusive, lockdown situation in a nursing home where you're just drugged and like drooling on yourself because they're allowed to do that? It's so scary.
It is. It's really concerning, and we need more public discussion about it and more people working on it, because the numbers, they're actually worse in Canada, and I don't really know why, but the United States, it ranges 14 to up to 30% of people in long-term care nursing homes who are being given antipsychotics, even higher numbers when we start to add in other psychotropics that may have numbing or sedating effects. And then the numbers in Canada can reach into 40 and 49%. That was a number I saw recently in one province. So it's just really concerning. And in a lot of cases, these people are getting subjected to it against their will, and maybe even against the will of their own families too.
So then it kind of leads me to ask next, like, how hard is it to get out of these situations? I mean, you mentioned Jim Gottstein, who's an attorney who knows all about these issues, and he has fought for the rights of some folks, and he wrote a book about, some of the difficulties he faced in representing people. But one thing he said in the interview with me that I found really frightening is that, like, he's like, most, just assigned lawyers, because most people who are in these institutions and stuff, they don't have any money. They're not like Britney Spears, who she can hire like the best of the best, and most people aren't going to get Jim Gottstein in their corner. So he said, you're going to get some overworked, overloaded, just public defender who doesn't really like give a crap that much or fight for you that hard. And so I'm wondering, like, in your research for this book, did you come across cases where people said, like, we tried this and this and spent all of this money and hired these lawyers, and like, it was impossible to get out once you're caught in the cobweb, essentially?
Yeah, it can be extremely difficult. That said, people do get out.
Mm-hmm.
Often one of the best ways is to just sort of play along and say, thank you very much, I really appreciate these drugs. Yeah, I'm feeling so much better, which is one of the reasons we have that narrative out there, because people quickly realize it's almost the only way you're going to get let out of the average institution is to quickly start playing along and saying thank you for it. And yes, I'm going to continue taking these, and because that's what the doctors are looking to hear. And so they'll let you go, and then you have your freedom back. back and you can kind of sneakily, hopefully, try to do what you think is truly best for you. So that can happen, and it does happen. And I also want to say, before I talk about the lawyers, I want to talk specifically about the good lawyers, because they're out there, the people like Jim Gottstein, and there's many lawyers I spoke with who really care about these issues, and they are public defenders. They're doing that, and they really care, and they learn, and they study, and they vigorously defend their clients and try to fight for their rights. And they are so important in this equation, and we got to hold them up and celebrate them. But studies have shown that, unfortunately, they're in a significant minority in most places, and a lot of them don't even have training. And then this word saneism comes up. There's a certain bias and prejudice against people who've been labeled. No matter who you are, if you've been labeled with a mental illness, even your own lawyer often looks at you a little askance and starts to think, well, that's what they're asking me to do, but I'm not really sure that's the best thing for them. And I've been in hearings where I could literally hear or see the person's own lawyer kind of rolling their eyes like, oh, judge, I'm sorry they're talking this way, and just get them locked up. You can almost hear them thinking this. And certainly when they spoke, you did not feel they were making the best case at all possible, that they just kind of have this prejudice that seeps in. And then they're often getting paid a pittance to do this work and to come up to speed. So it becomes a mix of different things that play into it. But studies have shown that, yeah, it's pretty common that public defenders are not really representing people well. And then what happens is, also, by putting up a fight, it seems like the medical staff tend to take this sort of personally. It really does. And so then they're like, oh, okay. And I maybe personally isn't the right word. They take it professionally in the sense, all things being equal, if you're putting up resistance, you're considered to be more sick than the person who's not putting up resistance. That's pretty well a rule of thumb in psychiatry. And so then they come at you even harder. So the more you get a good lawyer fighting for you, often it can start to backfire. And if you hire batteries of lawyers and stuff, then they're really taking it seriously now. And so, yeah, I've seen people battle this kind of stuff out. Often it's not specifically the commitment, although it will be if they've been thrown on an outpatient commitment order, so-called assisted outpatient treatment in America, community treatment orders in Canada, or extended leave. So this is a court-ordered situation where you're actually considered safe and capable of living in the community in your own home, but they're going to forcibly treat you anyway because they're just trying to prevent anything bad from happening, which they're making up in their own minds. Often it's just totally speculative. And this can go on for years and years and years. And those can be extremely difficult to get out of, because often the person is saying, hey, I'm doing fine now, and all the evidence shows they are doing fine, and they've been doing fine for years, and then that becomes evidence against them. The judge will sit there and listen to the psychiatrist say, oh, well, that's just because the drugs are doing wonders for them. And even the person says, no, I'm working really hard to just do all these things and be well, and these drugs are still really bothering me. They just won't be believed. The judge will go, you seem to be doing fine, so we're going to keep you on this drug. So that makes it's like a catch-22, makes it very hard to get out of these. And, I literally, and also just the deference to psychiatrists that go on in these cases. And I literally just got forwarded a case by somebody that I'm going to be writing about, where you see it went all the way to the Supreme Court in this province, and where the judge had to tell the lower level people, the judges, the tribunals, the lawyers, exactly this, to go, you're not supposed to just listen to the psychiatrist and agree with him. He had to explain, him or her, right? You have to actually make an assessment for yourselves. You're supposed to do that, because these tribunals and these other judges were just going like, well, if the psychiatrist says you're mentally ill, right? Well, we're not psychiatrists. We don't know. And the judge was saying, no, the law is that you're supposed to make an independent assessment. And that's what I see a lot. Like, these often judges and tribunal members don't even know what the law is or how it's supposed to work. And they just simply defer to psychiatrists. So that makes it really hard to get out of them once the psychiatrist thinks you need to be forcibly treated.
Yeah, I mean, just hearing that too, when you're talking about like the lack of data, it's like, even if we had data, how how could we trust it? Because it's so subjective, I guess, based on like what the psychiatrists are going to be reporting and like what they're diagnosing. And is that even real or relevant? But then if people are faking, which I hear all the time from, people who were subjected to any type of psychiatric treatment and wanted out of it, was like, yeah, I just finally caught, like, I realized I was going to have to tell them it's working, And so when I come across psychiatrists who say like, well, the patients say that it's helpful, like you start to wonder, well, sure, maybe they do, but how accurate is that really?
Exactly. Oh, exactly. Yeah. Like
Yeah.
the Orwellian nature of all this, the double think, the hypocrisy, the lying, like just that irony and alone that you just point out that, oh, on the one hand, one day we're saying you're so, insane, you're so incapable, you're so unable to understand reality yourself. We don't trust anything you say, anything you want. We are going to take away all your rights and forcibly drug you. That one day. The very day you say, I like these drugs, suddenly your opinion is held up as that's ultimate evidence that we did a good job. I mean, it's as if to say, oh, well, you've just locked someone up in a
Yeah.
in an institution and forcibly drugged them with a heavy psychoactive substance. And suddenly you're saying, oh, that makes their opinion more trustworthy than when they were not drugged and not detained and they were free. Like it's just the inanity of that sort of perspective is so ridiculous that's a major driver of this. That's one of their core arguments, is if they can get people, and as you and I know, countless people tell me, like, this isn't an uncommon thing. Countless people say, yeah, within a day or two, I learned, yeah, you have to go along. You have to be super polite and thankful, or you're never getting out of this situation. Like you people figure that, so they're lying through their teeth all the time, and then doctors are just gobbling it up, and then that becomes like the main argument in support of forced treatment throughout our society. It's brutal. And so then how would that pollute the data exactly? And that's why I agree with David Cohen again, who's talked about this and said, if we're going to do it, we need like multidisciplinary, right? We need survivors. We need, all sorts of different types of disciplines on sort of panels that are looking at that data, helping gather that data, helping identify what data do we really need. And I am a little bit optimistic lately that, this has been blocked for decades. So, the CMS does collect data about the quality of care in hospitals. And for many years, they refused to collect any quality of care data in psychiatric hospitals that had to do with patient reporting. So they just didn't, every other kind of hospital, they get patient reporting of, was the hospital good? How do you feel about the experience you had, right? And that's relevant to their ultimate quality of care assessment that they issue publicly. They've never allowed that. So they're considering now bringing that as a category of information in and publicly reporting out. So it will be interesting to see, the devil will be in the details, of course, what kind of reporting do they allow and how do they kind of summarize that information and all that. But obviously it could be revolutionary in psychiatric hospitals, because we know already, we do have data that says in America, 40% of the people in an average psychiatric hospital at any time don't want to be there. So we know right off the bat, 40% are going to be giving very negative assessments. And I believe, as I discussed in the book, the rate is probably much higher, because it's very common that you're just told, hey, if you play along, we won't involuntarily keep you, but you have to play along. And so people go, okay, I'll play along. So they're there basically involuntarily, even though on the books, they're a voluntary patient.
Yeah. So I have one or two more questions for you, and then I think we have some from the audience. I guess like a good way to close my questions for you is like, how do you think, or how do you feel about the way that we are handling people in distress now? I mean, I look around, especially with my own experience of psychiatric drug injury and withdrawal, which was minor, compared to these people who were like lost all their freedoms and everything. But just how like somebody, is saying like, I'm really struggling, or I need help. And our response seems to be, as a society, just like so cold, and like, call this random 1-800 number and talk to some, like, anybody but me, you know what I mean? Like, go over there and talk to the professional, or call this random number where you don't know anybody. And sort of the counter to that question is like, how can we do it better based on all the research that you've done? How do we improve the current system?
Yeah, we've over medicalized all of this tremendously, right? So even before we get to the force, and I think the force is just an extension of the over medicalization, and that's what I kind of highlight. I look in the book, and I just there's no end of alternative approaches to this stuff. And you highlighted one of them, a more community-based approach, where we're just more mindful in our daily lives and with the people we interact with, to be open to having these discussions about what's really happening in our lives, and be supportive and encouraging, and not just simply say, oh, you're sounding a little bit like you need professional help, because we've been trained now to do that, to go, oh, this is like a medical problem and you need professional help. And most often it's not anything close to that. It's a case where somebody's isolated, or they're genuinely struggling in their life because they don't have money, or they don't have support, and they're a single parent is struggling in isolation, or they're dealing with poverty and all sorts of other issues. And just like friendship and practical supports can really make a difference. So we need more of that. And of course, there's an array of different types of projects that have been piloted and tested and shown effective, even for intervening in people who are in severe crises of different kinds, but they're just not being implemented widely. And that
Like
goes back to
open dialogue, or like, is that
exactly.
Yeah, okay.
Open dialogue being a good example. That whole idea of getting everybody in a person's life together, talking openly together about, okay, why is what you're going through stressing me out, and what can we do together to help both of us? That's a wonderful dialogue to have, and I think there's tremendous opportunity there. Studies have indicated that it seems to be at least as effective, if not more effective, than other approaches, and it's just not being widely used in North America. And yeah, so examples like that. Many people voluntarily do like lots of non-drug therapeutic approaches, and why aren't more of those available in our psychiatric institutions? Well, it comes back to these laws that have basically made psychiatrists the most powerful. They've made physicians and psychiatrists the most powerful people in the equation. So no matter who you have on staff in any institution, ultimately the psychiatrist or physician has final authority. And that's written into these laws, and that's then how these institutions operate. And that needs to change. That's what I really highlight. We have to rupture that. It really needs a broader array of people having a greater authority, an interdisciplinary team at the very least. I would abolish it altogether. I just don't see any benefits to this kind of force. Maybe there's a justification for intervening as in a policing way with somebody to sort of restrain them. But once you get into all this mucking with people's minds and brains with drugs, like there's just no science to support it at all. And I show this in my book, what we know and don't know about the science. And I'm sure this is something your listeners have heard about a lot. There's lots of evidence they actually backfire and make people worse. That's probably why we have more people today than ever seeking out mental health supports, because they're not getting better with the supports they're getting. And so I say we need to start looking at other approaches, traditional approaches. Like there's, even as we look at the schools, there's all these cutbacks to arts funding and sports funding and all these things that used to bring kids together, clubs and groups and smaller class sizes and all these things that make the school experience better for kids. And instead we're going in the other direction and then medicalizing it all. If you got a classroom of 40 kids, some kids really disruptive, what can the teacher do? They end up going, okay, I'm going to have to call in the social worker. Oh, the kids expresses some anger or violence, and so now I have to call the psychiatrist. They have to go up to the hospital. That's how these things are playing out. It's a direct result of over medicalizing what began as just really kind of a social problem.
Yeah, and probably teachers feeling like their hands are tied because it's probably worked in, these are the steps that you have to follow, and you're bound by the rules of the school, or, whatever.
Yeah, they're being trained more and more like that. They still have leeway, but I have talked with social workers, for example, who told me within their careers, so the last 10, 20, 30 years, they've seen this change where they said, yeah, I used to be able to go in there and I would be talking with children and youth about suicidal feelings. Like that was my job, to just talk with them and kind of develop relationships with them over time, visit multiple schools and, work with these kids. And now it's basically like, if a kid mentions certain keywords, I have to check a box and then they're diverted to the psychiatrist and to the psychiatric hospital. And I don't even have a choice. I can't, like, if they so much as mention suicide, that's it. They're in another category now. So that's the kind of thing that is starting to happen. And we have to get in there and reopen that kind of process,
Yeah. I just thought of something when you were talking. Is there financial incentive to these institutions? Like we see people protesting with jails,
yeah. So
Yeah.
this is something I discovered. We don't have really good financial data. Some hospitals claim, oh, we lose money on psychiatric patients, but they don't provide the real numbers to look at that. I believe it's in principle possible because most of these services are very costly to provide. But it's important to understand that the base rate in the United States, for example, for just average psychiatric patient right off the bat is about $840 a day. More typical overall, once you're pulling in all the funding sources, would be $1,500 a day or more for a psychiatric institutionalization. And yeah, we have lots of evidence of mass scale fraud going on. And again, this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, how easy it is to actually entrap ordinary people. So we have lots of cases where the Department of Justice is wading in and suing. An excellent example of this was Universal Health Services, which is America's biggest psychiatric chain, 200 hospitals in the United States. And they recently settled a couple of years ago with the Department of Justice for $117 million for quote unquote unnecessary institutionalization of people who did not need to be psychiatrically hospitalized. So they were utilizing these powerful mental health laws to just entrap people. And I talked with someone myself who, she won her case. Ultimately, she did win a case against the hospital and got a financial settlement. But in this case, yes, she had simply gone in for a voluntary mental health assessment. They were offering free mental health assessment, right? Sounds nice. So she just went in there and made a couple jokes, like, because they, oh, this is Texas, how hard is it to find a gun, this kind of thing. And they're like, oh, that sounds like suicidal plan, locked her up. And she was one of many ultimately in this case that were being held. And so, this is not just one institution, it's multiple institutions, it's multiple companies. I've seen it in all sorts of different states. So yeah, this is a big problem. There's big profits being made from it. And it's been highlighted to me. And there's an interview with a healthcare fraud lawyer from the Department of Justice in my book that actually shocked me. Like, you think I'm using strong language? You should hear the language that this lawyer, who's actually seeing these cases on a day-to-day basis, was saying about these medical staff and how corrupt they were, and how corrupt these institutions were, and how abusive and how dangerous, and literally described like vans going to homeless encampments or to nursing homes or group homes and just giving kickbacks to the medical staff in these homes, and then loading people with Alzheimer's up in a van, and taking them to a hospital, and then just billing Medicare and Medicaid all day long to these astronomical sums of money. It's stories like this where you just like, is this real? Is this happening? And yeah, then you see all the legal documents and you go, oh, wow.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's dangerous.
Yeah. Well, and so easy. I mean, what is that experiment that they did? I read about it on Wikipedia, and it just made me like cackle with laughter about like, they went into a psychiatric hospital voluntarily and like pretended to be mentally ill, and they got diagnosed, and then they said like, ha ha ha, we were faking, and they said, well, oh, okay, we'll come back, send us more people, and don't tell us if they're, mentally ill or not, and we will get it right the second time. And they
Yeah.
came back and said, oh, you sent like 5 fakes and whatever. And they actually said, like, we didn't send you anybody the second time. So they, it's just so, what is that?
Yeah, the Rosenhan study on
Yeah.
being sane in insane places.
Yeah.
And that goes back some decades. It's a very interesting study and was quite provocative at the time. And I think it was provocative because everybody who kind of knew about how all this works suspected that could happen. Now, there has been a book put out recently about that study and raising questions about the quality of data and so forth. So I can't comment on that, but what I will say is it was abundantly clear to me that goes on today, all over the place. So regardless of the veracity and the full details of that particular study today, I can speak from my own research and studies and point to lots of cases where this is clearly, it is very unclear what's happening and why somebody's being detained and whether an ordinary person would really think that this person was quote unquote mentally ill in that kind of way. The gray areas are so vast, and it's a real problem. And even the most recent studies for DSM-5 that looked at this, where they trained professional psychiatrists and psychologists to implement the diagnostic criteria in the most recent edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, they found very low levels of agreement between them on most issues. There were a few that are really obvious, like PTSD, right? Because, well, if you're having traumatic memories from a distant time, that's a pretty clear diagnostic criteria that relates to PTSD. So that's a relatively easy one. And they were relatively high agreement there. But once you get into depression or schizophrenia or anxiety disorders or any of these other much more common disorders, it's off the rails. There's just no levels of reasonable scientific agreement. In fact, it was so bad, they just translated all the numbers. They went, okay, let's start calling, poor good, and let's start calling good excellent levels of agreement. You can see the paper trail where they literally made the decision to do that just to make themselves sound better than they were.
Yeah. So last question for me, there's this quote by someone, I'm not sure, it's when I looked it up last, it said Sally Clare, which I don't know if that's the real person, but they said on journalism, if someone says it's raining and another person says it's dry, it's not your job to quote them both. Your job is to look out the fucking window, right? And tell us which one is true. So you're a journalist. And all of the psychiatric reporting that we see, I get excited when we get even a little bit of critical something in an article, hey, these people over here who are injured or who don't like this or who were forcibly whatever, they're allowed to be in this article. But always too, there's this other part. It's well, it's good for people and it's helping and it's working, but there's these people over here. And so then it just seems like a pointless read because it's both things at once. And do you get what I'm getting at? What do you think about that?
Yeah,
when it comes to this?
I love that quote. I've used something like that myself over the years too.
Yeah.
I love that. And I will say, gosh, even if we had more survivors being interviewed, that would be a step in the right direction, right? Because it's often, I don't even see the other side presented in most news reports that I'm seeing. I'm just seeing the side of we need to forcibly treat people and it's wonderful. And even if you get any survivor interviewed, it'll just be somebody going, I'm grateful for it. And you won't learn anything else of the details of, well, what did you really mean? And all of that, right? Let alone the person who goes, I hated it and I was traumatized by it. And I think even if we did hear more of that, that would be a huge step in the right direction. But I agree overall, and I think this is a big problem for coverage of anything to do with psychiatry that we're seeing in our culture right now. There's a stunning lack of independent investigating going on. It's just sort of taken for granted as if a psychiatrist is the equivalent of a mathematician, that I'm not really able as a journalist to understand this high level mathematics this mathematician is quoting. So I just quote him and that's the end of the matter, right? Okay, that's what the mathematician says. And here's another mathematician who really likes him. He says the same thing. And it's like a lot of journalists are approaching psychiatry in that way. Whereas we know when you delve into it at all, as soon as you scrape the slightest layer of that away, you realize that no, psychiatry really doesn't have that level of scientific evidence. It's actually not a very complicated or complex science at all. And then when you delve into the scientific studies, you can see very clearly how much mumbo jumbo is being just thrown around and manipulated and all that, because really they're just trying to say, oh, did a person feel better? Did they report feeling better? Did I decide that I think they're better? That's what they all come down to, right? That's all that's going on. It's not very scientific at all. And that's the foundation for most of these scientific studies of forced treatments or almost anything to do with psychiatry or psychology. So yeah, so we're kind of off the rails there. And so I think journalists need to bring a lot more healthy, independent critique to really reach out and find those critics, because right now they're not. And admittedly, of course, a lot of people are underground right now. So we need also, I think, within the critical community, more organizations, more people willing to speak out publicly and present. And of course, I understand all the reasons people are reluctant to do that because of the bigotry out there against psychiatric patients and all of that. So I'm not pressuring anyone into this, but I am saying it would be great if overall we could come together and get more groups and allies organized and speaking out, responding to legislation, responding to news stories, putting out their own press releases, commenting on studies and all that, because there's just not a lot of that right now compared to the other side, which of course has massive amounts of industry funding backing it.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, it just goes back to what you said earlier in the interview. Like if you have a diagnosis of any kind, or people know that you were in the, you had psychiatric services, it's all automatically, you're looked at differently, you're viewed differently. And so people are really hesitant. But I think I would say to that, like, so many people are diagnosed and drugged today. It's like 1 in 5 on medications in America, so it's like for all kinds of just everything. I mean, everywhere you look around, somebody's taking medications. And so I think it's less bad as far as like, you're not just some like rare, everyone's on antidepressants or benzodiazepines or whatever. That, I mean, that's a diagnosis in itself. So you can make the case for like, well, this is just actually an overdiagnosis problem, not like I'm actually mentally ill. And enough of us, I think, are speaking out about it. And there's power in numbers, and there's power in, just people standing together and like complaining and saying publicly, like, this happened to me, this happened to me. And I'm just thinking about like, even on the withdrawal front, like how dangerous the medications are to come off of, how much more just people speaking out has gotten us as far as like making strides. When I first got ill, there was like one video on YouTube, and now it's like, I mean, it's just flooded. And I think the result of that has been more news articles, changes in some of the things over in the UK. They've just come forward and put new NICE guidelines forward. There's an FDA panel right now that I'm a part of where they're including the patients on trying to make guidelines for deprescribing benzodiazepines. And all of that, I think, came about because of people speaking out and like reporting publicly that these injustices were being done. So
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I agree. And I'd love to see that continue and extend into the arena of people who've experienced involuntary commitment, because the numbers we have suggest that at least millions, if not more than millions, of people in America and Canada have experienced involuntary psychiatric detentions. And where are those people? I'm enormously grateful for the people who've reached out to me to share their stories, and those people who will also go on the record, some of them using their actual names and sharing details and sharing their histories and medical records and so forth with me. Like, because of them, I could write this book. The book would be nowhere without those people who had that courage and willingness yes, to think also just beyond themselves, right? To think this could benefit others, and to do that, and and I keep track of those people too, because I'm hoping that they don't experience blowback as a result of it, right? And some do. I know I've heard it from other journalism coverage in this area that people have experienced blowback and then not gotten the support of even the journalism outlet. So fortunately, I write a lot for Mad in America, and obviously we have an infrastructure of support for people there. So I always feel confident that, hey, if somebody were to experience some sort of blowback as a result of an article I did, coverage of them, that I'd have the support of Bob Whitaker and everybody there to go, how can we help in this situation, because we know that person really went out on a limb to share their story, and what can we do to try to make sure that they continue to get I don't know if support's the right word, but ongoing coverage of the situation if they feel that's going to benefit them, or something else, right? Or even removal of that story, or removal of their real name. Like that's an instance where I've seen that, where someone asked me, could you just take the picture away? Because people are finding my picture, and that's a bigger disclosure. And although the person was comfortable at the time, they weren't later. And so I went, sure, yeah, like why not? It's like a year later, it's like, just take the picture away, and so that person just felt more comfortable with their story up there. But that's something some journalism outlets just won't do, so yeah, there needs to be a broad understanding, I think, of how I say that this kind of experience too is, for many people, they literally compare it to sexual assault, involuntary treatment. And so of course they're reluctant to speak out. Like even people who've been sexually assaulted will say this to me. They'll say it was the same or worse to experience forced treatment. And, what can you say to that? And so obviously it's understandable why those people feel reluctant to speak out. But as you were saying earlier, we need to bring them together with others who've experienced it for different reasons in different ways, so that people understand the broad spectrum of people this is happening to, and there's no reason to feel that level of stigma about it, and to understand that, yes, we need to speak out, and there will be power in those kinds of numbers. And I think that's where you bring in the lawyers as well, and that's what I'm trying to just contribute, be another voice in that equation, so that people realize it's not just about those people. They aren't the only ones protesting and raising concerns about this. So yeah, I wholeheartedly agree, and I thank you today for contributing to that in everything. The way Medicating Normal, I have to disclose, I too helped with the Medicating Normal film, and it's a great film. I heartily endorse people watch it for a range of reasons. And yeah, and thank you for highlighting the issue of involuntary commitment today as a piece of that puzzle. And often I say, look at these withdrawal experiences people are having, and imagine now someone who'd never even had the agency, to get into it. They were literally forced into that situation. It's just all the more, brutal for them to have to go through it,
Yeah. All right, so a couple audience questions and then we'll close. This one we kind of already touched on, but she said, did you meet people who voluntarily started psychoactive medication and then they got severe withdrawal symptoms and they got forced treatment because the withdrawal was misdiagnosed essentially as, some severe mental illness?
Oh yeah, that happens a lot. In fact, arguably, I would say everyone who's been on these medications, usually if they're trying to go off them, they start experiencing withdrawal effects. It's very common. And yeah, those will always be diagnosed as something else in these situations, and then consequently some percentage of those people, if those withdrawal symptoms or the rebound, as we know, the withdrawal symptoms can also themselves be a trigger for something else. So you do get like confused about what's affecting what here, but yeah, those people will end up involuntarily committed. And in fact, there's a story of that in my book, of a very profound case where the woman's gradually getting put on more and more medications, and then all of the adverse effects of the medications are being uber diagnosed as mental illnesses in and of themselves. And then even if she's trying to get off them, and doing okay in that process, she's she's discovered, so she's actually doing well, but that's not enough, because often they'll just say, we don't believe it. Even if you're looking okay right now, we don't believe you're going to be well long enough, so we're going to force you. And so she had to flee the state in order to fully get herself freed from that forced treatment. Even though she was already successfully off them. So, yeah.
Oh, do some laws not carry over? So like you can leave a state and get away from an order. Like if you're in Virginia and you go to Arizona, you could get away from the court.
Yeah, definitely. Like there's very little right now of interstate or interprovincial agreements. In fact, even with guardianships, they're not very strong. From what I can see, there's a move on, I do know, in the guardianship realm to try to make guardianships transferable from region to region more easily, because right now some people have escaped them that way, and some people will argue, oh, that's a bad thing, right? For this or that reason. But in any case, so that's why they're trying to stop it. But in this area, as far as I know, no, they don't cross over. Now, occasionally you'll get flagged as a missing person, and that will be transferred as a record over. So if you start interfacing with police for any reason in the other jurisdiction, and particularly if there is a history of, say, violence associated on your record, they're going to be a little more concerned about that and vigorous about it. But I'd say for the average civil commitment patient, currently it is a way to potentially escape. Obviously, you need resources to do that, right? You need support, capacity, money, somehow to be able to do that. But I have heard about people doing it successfully. And in fact, I report on one case in my book, and there was another case that I used to have in the book, but had to cut it at the last minute. But she had also escaped that way deliberately. So, and she was this person was put on a missing persons report, but she voluntarily went into the police as she arrived in the new location, and they said, okay, well, you don't meet our criteria right now, so I can't detain you, even though in the other state they're saying please detain her. The police said we can't legally detain you, so she was free to go. And so then she went even further to another jurisdiction after that, totally freed.
Wow. Okay, good to know that, at least there's some little loopholes, in the system, that people have discovered.
Yes.
I guess last closing question, Rob, is, who could benefit from your book, or who do you want to read it? And if you can, impress one single important thing on the public, if they can't read your book, like, what do you want people to know most about what you've written about?
I think the biggest message for me is just be aware that this can happen, so that you can prepare yourself in some way and think about what preparation might look like for you if you're engaging with the mental health system in some way, or in situations where you might be interfacing with police, or around people who might be quick to call 911 or something like that on you in a situation. So that means having lots of friends and supporters, and hopefully family members that support you, and even getting some written documents written up, like a psychiatric advance directive. Even if it's not legally applicable in your jurisdiction, write it up anyway, because it's an average judge who's honest will at least consider something like that. What did the person say they wanted in the situation? Is that reasonable or not, given the situation? So that you don't completely panic and just rebel in anger and hostility in this situation. The best strategy is being calm, figure out what your rights are, talk to your lawyer, talk to all the staff in a calm, measured voice, try to document what's happening to yourself. So that's what I say. Just be aware so that you're not panicking in these kinds of situations. And then who do I want to read it? I want everyone to read it. I think the broader public needs to be aware of this, but I did really feel all along that I wanted people who are already kind of aware of this sort of stuff to get benefit from the book. And I will say I learned a lot, even though I'd been researching this stuff for 20 years. I learned a lot from my own research for the book. And I hear a lot from people who are already well-versed in these issues, that they got a lot from it. And I don't know, among survivors, I hear both messages. Sometimes people are like, this book is just too triggering for me on every page. I can barely get through it. And other people have said, this is really therapeutic for me. I can't believe it to see myself reflected and my views and experiences reflected in all these other people's experiences and among this wide range of society. Yeah, that's so exciting. And I feel so touched and excited. So I've heard both of those stories, and I don't know what predicts how a person will react. But so I did write it for both groups, people who are aware, but I tried to make it an educational book for people who don't really know anything at all. And I've heard some positive feedback about that. Somebody said, oh, I shared it with a family member, a relative, and it's really improved our relationship now that they see that I'm not alone in having had these experiences and that there's a broader range of critique around this stuff.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. So anybody who wants to read Rob's book, we're going to link it below for you so that you can get a copy. And before we go, there is an announcement on August 30th from 12 p.m. to 1:15 p.m. Eastern. You, Rob, are giving a seminar with Georgetown University called The Rising Rates, Expanding Uses, and Often Traumatizing Impacts of Psychiatric Detention and Forced Treatment. So if anybody wants to register and attend that Georgetown presentation, we'll also link it for you below.
That's great. And that'll be for the question around what if people can't read your book or don't read your book, I'd say, well, this will be a crash course overview going through statistics and data a lot more methodically than, so that people might find that interesting. It's a bit of a crash course in some of the laws, the science, the economics, kind of this quick snapshot of it through the book. The other thing I want to highlight is right now you can get 60% off the audiobook for another day or two at Audible. Through Audible. So, and you can find links on my social media, Twitter, Facebook, or at my website for some of this as well. But yeah, basically Audible selling it at 60% off. And there's just contact me for the link if you don't see it on my social media through my website. And also, I think the ebook is still available. It was as of yesterday for only $3.99, the Kindle version. So in the audiobook for $10, the Kindle version for $3.99. And you can always get 30% off the hardcover through Ben Bella Books at their website for 30% off just using the code RIGHTS. So just enter that code when you're ordering the book.
Okay, RIGHTS, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, got it. So we'll also below put a link to Rob's website, all of his social media, his email, and his blog at Mad in America too. So if you need to reach him or learn more about him and what he's doing, please do follow him on social media. So, all right, I think we're at time. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining us for this live discussion. If you haven't seen Medicating Normal yet and you want to, you can go to our website at medicatingnormal.com/watch for the many ways you can view it. Thank you so much again, Rob, for joining me and for writing this book and doing this important work that you do. And yeah, I'm excited. I'll come to the Georgetown event and tune in. So.
All right. Well, thank you so much. It was wonderful talking with you.
All right. Good to see you again. Yeah.
Yes, likewise. All right.
Bye, everybody. Take care.
Bye-bye.